Welcome to Sundial. I'm Carlos Frias. It's Pride Month, a chance for the LGBTQ community and their allies to mark how far we've come and to look at how much farther we still have to go. Here in Florida, this year's festivities fall against the backdrop of new state laws. New laws that threaten queer and transgender rights and forms of expression. These new laws limit access to gender-affirming healthcare, classroom discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity, even attending drag performances. Chasten is no stranger to these conversations. He's a former teacher and LGBTQ advocate. He's also the husband of Pete Buttigieg, the current U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Chasten traveled the country with Pete while he was running for president in 2020. Now, Chasten is traveling the country again, but for a very different reason. He's on tour for his book, I Have Something to Tell You. He's adapted his memoir for a young queer audience, and he's made it a point to stop in Florida to talk to people here about it. Chasten sat down in our WLRN studios with my colleague, Mike Makrovich. He's our breaking news editor for the newsroom. I hope you enjoy their conversation. A quick note before we start. Mike and Chasten touch on a few sensitive topics, including the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando that killed 49 people. This month marks 7 years since the tragedy. It may be upsetting to some listeners. After their chat, I'll bring Mike into the studio and we'll talk about it. Here's Mike.
Talk to me about the decision to adapt your 2020 memoir, I Have Something to Tell You, into a version geared toward young adults. Why was it important to you to open a dialogue with this age group specifically?
So when I started writing the book over 2 years ago, I just wanted to write the book that I wish I could travel back in time and hand my 8th grade self. I was hopeful that the book would be helpful for some, for parents, for teachers, for young people. But the political landscape was not what it is today regarding queer stories. I just wanted to write the book I know young Chasten could have used. And as a former middle school teacher myself and now a parent, I've been thinking a lot about the lessons that we teach young people, what kind of world we want to raise them in. So Miami is now, I think, we're probably over 20 cities now that we've hit around the country. This is my second stop in Florida, and I'm really excited to have this conversation here.
And, you've said time and again how, these books you wrote were meant to support and galvanize LGBTQ readers. You detail some pretty traumatic experiences from growing up rather candidly. When you were writing, I'm curious, was there any part of you that was maybe reluctant about accessing and, sort of reprocessing those difficult memories?
Yeah, well, especially some of the memories that I thought I was done with, that I had worked on in therapy, that I had gotten over. And part of writing a really relatable story is to write in a way that allows the reader to come along on that journey with you. And I wanted the valleys and the peaks of this story to be at their extremes. So when I am trying to describe what it was like, feeling like I would never make it out of the closet, fearing for my life growing up in northern conservative Michigan, I wanted the reader to know exactly what I was going, or at least be able to empathize or feel with what young Chasten was experiencing. But also the joy, of course. I really like peppering in all the funny bits and some silly stories so that young people can either see themselves reflected on the page or at least have that window into someone else's world where they might be able to empathize with that journey. But certainly some of the harder points about the story took me a long time to complete because there were days I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to write about it. But I'm glad that I did because it's important that people see someone has been here, someone has felt this before, and it does get better.
And, I'm really thankful for how you framed that. When you were sitting down to write these books, were you just ready to put pen to paper? When it comes to specifically, sort of reprocessing, these more tumultuous experiences, if you will, was that something you were ready to put pen to paper right away? Or did you kind of just, have to work yourself up to that point, if you will?
So much of the story in the beginning was just thinking about young me. And it was the presidential campaign that allowed me to see that all of these stories and experiences and feelings were not unique to me. They're almost uniquely American, especially amongst young queer people. But thinking about that scared kid in the closet, what would have comforted him? What does he need to know? And what are the lessons I've learned along the way that I wish I would have known earlier? But then I became a dad. My kids were born about a year into writing. And then I started thinking about the work that I leave behind for my kids, and will these words comfort them one day? What kind of world do I want them to grow up in? What kind of people do I want them to become? And I hope that some of the lessons in the book will comfort them one day. I also sort of hope that this book becomes irrelevant one day, that we won't have to argue about books like this, or that all of these lessons won't be as needed, because it will just become common. I don't know if every writer says that about their book, but I hope that one day maybe my kids will ask, why was it so important to write a book like that? Why were people really debating whether or not LGBTQ people were full and equal members of society?
Yeah, and it seems counterintuitive on its head, right? But I can totally understand that. So now, when all is said and done, and now that we're on the other side of this, the books are out, you're on your tour now. Was it cathartic?
Oh, extremely. It's also nerve-wracking when you put something out into the world and you see it on the bookshelves and you know that you can't change it anymore. But the book tour itself has been remarkable, especially meeting people in redder places of our country that are seeking community and seeking connection. The audience Q&A portions of the book tour events have been really inspiring, but also very emotional. Speaking with teachers, young queer people, speaking with librarians, and also connecting with local LGBTQ organizations around the country who are doing a lot of this work on the front lines.
And, you bring up a really great point. I actually heard you talk about this in a previous interview, but I'd love to be able to unpack it with you a little bit, if I may. But you mentioned, the opportunity to connect with young LGBTQ folks in particular, on this tour. And oftentimes, they're opening up to you about, their own respective traumas.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about carrying that with you?
Yeah.
And, how you're sort of able to compartmentalize?
Well, anytime somebody shares something with you, if they come out to you or they're sharing that grief with you, I try to accept that as a gift. Someone is trying to take me along on their journey, or someone is trying to allow me to see into their world. And rather than feeling like that's a burden to carry all of these stories with me, I see it as an opportunity to do good with it. Now I get to share their stories around the country. I am reminded the importance of being a good advocate and an ally. And I see and I experience a very visceral connection to the realities of queer people around the country. But I don't let that, bog me down with sadness. I see it as a calling and a reminder of why we're all here and why we're doing what we're doing. And some of these people at the events are just trying to figure out if they're doing enough. And sometimes when it's just a parent asking, what more can I do? Reminding them that loving your kid unconditionally is a miracle. Because not everybody gets that. Not everybody gets a loving parent. Not everybody gets to go to school and have a teacher that affirms them. Not everybody gets to be surrounded by a community that wants them there. So reminding people of the little things that they can do to be an ally, starting with just reminding your kids that they're loved unconditionally, is just a great way that I get to use this platform while I'm traveling the country and having these conversations.
And speaking of the tour, you mentioned Miami is your second Florida city,
yes,
correct? Was there anything about South Florida, that compelled you and your team to want to make it part of the tour?
Actually, it was many folks in South Florida who reached out to me. It's kind of hard to plan a tour and know where to go, and so many incredible LGBTQ organizations in South Florida came together and wanted to put this together. The ACLU, PFLAG, Safe Schools South Florida, just to name a few. And so we worked it into the schedule. It's a little bit harder now because tour proper, I guess, air quotes, tour proper is over. I thought it was only going to be 2 weeks, but it just keeps growing because more people want to have these connections and want to have these conversations. And so I keep trying to fit them in where I can. And I'm so glad that we made South Florida work.
And this goes without saying, but as you are acutely aware, you're here in South Florida, and in Florida more broadly, at a very, shall I say, consequential time in its politics. When it comes to Florida schools, it's very possible, frankly, that your book could be banned or restricted in some sense. Either way, it's now legal in many cases to openly discuss sexual orientation and gender identity in the classroom. What do you make of that? How have you processed that?
So I think some people in Florida in big positions of power have to ask themselves, are LGBTQ people full and equal members of society? Do they deserve to be full and equal members of society? Many of these arguments about books, curriculum, teachers, parents, it all boils down to fear over the question of whether or not LGBTQ people deserve to be equal. There are some pieces of legislation in your state that were designed to be vague on purpose to scare people into not even doing things as simple as putting up a picture of their spouse on their desk. I always had a picture of, my parents, my dogs behind my desk in my classroom, and my husband. Thinking about something like the Pulse Memorial this Pride Month, remembering the 7th anniversary of Pulse, wondering, would a teacher be allowed to discuss that in the classroom because it centers on LGBTQ people who are massacred at the hands of a gunman? Some of these people in positions of power are just going to have to ask themselves what they truly stand for, and if LGBTQ people are deserving of that equality. I believe that they are, and that's why I'm happy to be here in South Florida to have this conversation, but also to remind allies how needed they are, and to remind people in the community that there are millions of other people around this country and in the state who support them and who will keep fighting for them.
Florida's majority Republican legislature passed a dizzying number of anti-LGBTQ bills this past session. Lawmakers banned gender-affirming care for minors. There are new restrictions on drag shows. All that said, some families with queer children or parents have left Florida.
Yeah.
What do you think of when you hear things like this?
Well, I don't think that should be a reality in the United States of America, that a family has to pack up and move across state lines because of the politics in one state threatening their very existence. But let me say something else about your legislature and what's going on there. Attacking the LGBTQ community is really easy. It requires no work. It's so simple to be hateful and small-minded. And they've acknowledged this. They threw everything at the wall. They wanted to see what would stick. And right now, it's attacking vulnerable youth. Trans kids. That means these people were elected into a powerful position. They go to your state house, and rather than focus on, name anything, rather than focusing on building bridges or fixing the roads or actually improving education by giving teachers what they really need, the resources that they really need, starting with teacher pay, they're just attacking kids. It's super simple because it doesn't actually really require doing much, and many of these bills are sort of copy and paste, and that's the annoying thing for many young people when I'm meeting them around the country, that the adults in the room in these big positions of power go to work and they decide that rather than focusing on gun violence or climate change, or fixing the grid, they're focused on attacking children, mostly because it's, really easy politically. They can say something crazy, put it in an email, fundraise off of it, and rinse and repeat. And we're talking about kids. We're talking about kids who just want to go to school and survive. I know what it's like to be that kid in the closet and to wonder whether or not it's actually safe to be yourself, to be your most authentic self. And when you're in a position of power and your number one target is a kid, and in my opinion, when the number one cause of death amongst young people in our country is guns, you decide the thing that needs focusing on is the kid and not the gun. It's a gross imbalance of priority.
In more ways than one, it sounds to me what like you're describing is making this group of people, this minority, a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
And social issues, of course, have become sort of this lightning rod for discourse in conservative circles. Of course, particularly issues surrounding trans and queer civil liberties. I'm curious, if you have any thoughts as to the timing. Like why now? Why here, and why all of these various states, and not just Florida? Texas, for instance.
Well, like I said, it's just really, really easy for these folks. So they have found something that is much easier to focus on rather than the real work, rather than rolling up their sleeves, working across the aisle to get stuff done that will impact not just less than 1% of the American population, but a much larger percent of the American population. Did you know that trans people comprise less than 1% of the United States population? Trans youth comprise a much smaller percentage of that. So around the country, you have these people who have decided that rather than focusing on improving the lives of many and focusing on real issues, they can really drive a cudgel between the American people and themselves by attacking vulnerable kids. And here's the other thing that I don't think enough people are acknowledging. When I was growing up in northern Michigan, I didn't know any trans people. When I went to college in northern Wisconsin, I didn't know any out trans people. It wasn't until I was on the presidential campaign that I was truly given an opportunity to sit down with multiple different communities of trans people, trans healthcare organizations, LGBTQ organizations, and meet with people and learn their stories and be given the opportunity to both learn and unlearn some things that I thought about trans people. And I'm very curious as to whether or not these people in these big positions of power have actually ever met a trans person, have ever listened to a trans person. And they're certainly not listening to the larger, reputable American medical community who is telling them that gender-affirming care is life-saving care. They just go to their state houses and pass bills because that's the thing that they're raising money off of and getting all of their clicks out of. And that's a really sad day in America when the clicks and the money are worth more than keeping those young people alive.
Sitting here now, what work is still ahead? And, what role do you see yourself filling?
I appreciate being given the opportunity to travel the country and talk with folks and uplift their stories and learn more. Constantly attempting to evolve and be a better ally and an advocate, and sometimes it feels like I'm a spokesman for the entire community. Right now, trans people, and specifically, really need even people in our own community to step up. This is a season for active allyship. I want people who consider themselves to be allies of the LGBTQ community to ask themselves, have I earned that title, or have I just given it to myself? And if you think maybe you've just given it to yourself, ask yourself how you're going to earn it. And I think you earn it with time, money, or privilege. Many of us walk through the world with more privilege than other people. So ask yourself how you're using it. Or donate your time to organizations that really need you, even in things like mentorship and money. There are organizations like Equality Florida here who would gladly take your donation, who are fighting some of these draconian anti-LGBTQ bills up at the State House. But ask yourself what you're truly doing to show up and be an active ally. I'm always thinking about that as an advocate for my own community. In what ways am I truly putting my advocacy into action, doing more than maybe just posting a picture on social media or wearing the t-shirt? But am I uplifting the right stories? Am I reaching out and reminding people that someone's out there fighting for them? And I think we can all ask ourselves, in what little ways are we continuing to contribute to the ideas of progress and equality? a teacher might lose their license in this state for discussing what happened at Pulse when a gunman killed 49 people, mostly LGBTQ people.
And that said, Chasten, I'm wondering, when you have, these, you lead a very, very active life, of course. You were out on the campaign trail, and you're on this national tour now. You're getting to engage with countless folks from all different kinds of walks of life. When you have those quieter moments to yourself, when you're, say, laying in bed at night, how do you challenge yourself to, I guess, be more of an active ally to these communities?
Something I'm always trying to do is seek out opportunities to learn. That's reaching out to people who operate trans nonprofit organizations. I meet regularly with lawyers who are working on some of these bills around the country, so I can get into the nitty-gritty of what is being argued. And so I know what I'm talking about on the radio or television or at these book events, but I want to do more than just retweet a news article or wear my t-shirt from Target or whatever. I want to find ways to just know more. And one of the things that I really appreciate is learning other people's stories. Because at the end of the day, I'm only one letter in our large acronym, right? And so my experiences might not even mirror somebody else in our community. So being given the opportunity to learn those stories, to carry those stories with me, and to know who I'm uplifting, and to be reminded of what we're all fighting for. And the things that really give me hope at the end of the day are my kids too. It reminds me of what's real. And being a good dad is the first job and the most important job in my life. And for all parents, just please tell your kids that you love them unconditionally. I'm focused on raising my kids in a world where they will be applauded for being empathetic and kind and accepting. And so I try to focus on that. I focus on what's real, not social media and the dumpster fire that can be social media sometimes, but the real work in front of me.
I'd like to pivot back, if I may, to an earlier point here, about families with either queer children or parents themselves, who decide the best thing for their families in light of the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and now law, is to leave the state altogether.
Yeah.
As you've alluded to, a couple of years ago, you and your husband adopted 2 children.
Yeah.
What might you say to these families who are vulnerable, who are afraid? What message do you have for Florida households who may be navigating this right now?
Yeah. Those parents are making decisions for themselves, and that's a really hard decision to make. But like many things, I want parents to be the ones to make that decision about safety for themselves and their family, but to know that there are millions of other people in this country who are fighting for them, who want them to be safe, who affirm their identity and their existence, and who also, frankly, are really fed up with some of the people who are going after them and not the real issues facing millions of other Americans. Safety always comes first, though. Anytime we're talking about advocacy or allyship or coming out, your safety always comes first. So if a parent makes the decision that the safest thing that they can do is leave, I want to support them in that, even though I might grieve with them that they had to make that decision in the United States of America.
To follow up on that briefly, how does anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and legislation that we've talked about contribute to the violence that we see in instances like Pulse, for instance?
Yeah. This is something I think about all the time because my social media has certainly never been as nasty as it is today. And maybe that has to do with some leadership in social media companies. But even when I was crisscrossing this country, on a presidential campaign, I never saw it as bad as it is today. Constant threats of violence, disgusting imagery. When you are in a position of power, people listen to what you have to say. You got to take that seriously, especially when you're emboldening people to be more hateful. I know it's nasty out there, but it's really important to remind people that the majority of American people support LGBTQ equality. And not just the majority of the American people. The majority of Republicans support LGBTQ equality. But unfortunately, this very, very vocal minority, in some places, like your state, has control over state houses and legislatures. And they have the gavels, and they're passing the bills. And they're not focused on the things that the majority of Americans want them to focus on. They're focused on the easy stuff, the stuff that raises them money and gets them clicks, and I guess helps them hold on to power. But my idea of politics is not about who you're against, but it's about who you're for, and how you make people feel bigger-hearted and welcomed. It's about how you inspire community and belonging. And I think this season of politics, we've just seen some people who might not know how to lead.
Are you concerned that, we might see sort of the regression in LGBTQ rights and liberties continue to spread beyond states like Florida and in Texas, especially as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis launches a campaign for the White House?
Yeah, like I said, my experience with politics is about who you're for, what you're for. It's got to be more than one buzzword. His buzzword is woke. Everything's woke. Donald Duck is woke. The M&Ms are woke. The gays are woke. Everything's woke. I think people are going to get really tired of that really fast. So that's a problem for him to sort out. How are you going to inspire the American people to believe that you're truly the person that should lead the country when the only thing you're talking about is who you're against? Talking about leading a country and bringing people together, sowing division, is not the same thing as bringing people together. You mentioned a regression in equality. The thing that is important to remember is that the majority of Americans support LGBTQ equality. And so if you're running for president on a platform that's against LGBTQ equality, then you are running against the majority of Americans. That's a him problem. And so as allies and advocates, we all have to focus on not only defending our community, but also reminding these people in positions of power, you're against the American majority. The majority of Americans not only support LGBTQ equality, but are also kind of fed up with your nonsense and are ready for you to start focusing on the real work.
You and Secretary Buttigieg, relatively recently, I should say, bought a home in your northern Michigan hometown.
Yeah.
You've talked a lot about sort of the progress that, your own hometown has made, with respect to LGBTQ rights and just becoming, altogether this more sort of progressive space.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what has it been like when it comes to just you? If we're talking about yourself and your husband in a vacuum, what are some ways that you've connected to your local LGBTQ community back in Michigan?
Well, it's we didn't have a pride organization in northern Michigan when I was growing up, and now we do. And one of the most beautiful things that they have are these yard signs that just say Up North Pride. And whether you identify as LGBTQ or an ally, you see them popping up, within the city and way out in the county. To see them at the end of a dirt road is really inspiring. Just a simple way to signal to your neighbors that you're here, you're not going anywhere, and that you've got their backs. I'm very grateful for Up North Pride and the fact that now we have a celebration in northern Michigan, and the parade they had in 2019 that I got to walk in was actually just a march. It was one of the most beautiful pride marches I'd ever seen because there was no corporate sponsorship, there were no floats, I don't even think there was a marching band. I don't remember. It was just thousands of people walking down Front Street, Traverse City, Michigan, reminding everyone that we're here.
Oh, wow.
I got to hold my mom's hand. a town that I thought I was going to run away from and never come back. And it's so inspiring to be back home and to see this city dedicating itself to progress and wanting everyone to know that there is space for them. There's a lot of work left to be done, but the work is happening, and I'm happy to be part of it.
Your husband's star skyrocketed during the 2020 Democratic primary. And of course, he'd go on to become Secretary of Transportation under President Biden. But let's talk about your own ambitions. What does the future hold for Chasten Buttigieg over the course of the next, say, 5 years?
I remember on our first date asking Pete the "where do you see yourself in 5 years" question, and he kind of reminds me of this and pokes fun at me because I had been on so many bad dates and all of these terrible breakups and was so tired of getting my heart broken and was so just kind of focused on are there legs here? And I told him at the time that I was in graduate school at the time. I was getting my master's in education in Chicago, and I had found theater education. That's the thing that made me feel happy and successful in my career, but I'd always wanted to be a dad. The thing that I always knew I wanted was to be a dad. And for a long time, I felt that was out of reach. I never knew that was going to be available to me. I just want to be a really good dad. I hope that I get to teach again. The book tour has sort of made me feel like I'm kind of back in a quasi-classroom, nationwide classroom, I guess. But just focusing on being a good dad is really important to me. One, because it's a dream I never thought I would have, and two, because it's happening too fast. Now they're almost 2, and everyone just says, the days are long and the years are short, and it's so true. So I want to be really present for these, pivotal years in their life. And everything that comes professionally, I hope I get to keep writing. I'm working on a children's book right now. I've really enjoyed writing, and we'll see.
And I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge for our listeners here, who, of course, aren't in the studio with us, but the way you just light up when you talk about your family and your children. It's really special.
I really do become that annoying guy that's like, "Do you want to see pictures? Do you want to see pictures of my kids?" I love them. They just remind me of everything that's real in life. And I used to be like way too online, during the presidential campaign, and now I just love that. I try to remind everyone, like, you have this great power when it comes to social media, which is that you can turn your phone off. And my kids make it so easy to put my phone away and to not be online because I'm playing with train sets and we're coloring and, we're blowing bubbles in the backyard with our bubble wands and our bubble machine. And I just love being a dad and staying present and reminding myself that the most important thing I can do right now is be a really good dad to them.
And we're coming up on time here, Chasten. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about your books, about this tour, about what's ahead for you and Pete and your family?
No, the only thing I want people to know, especially during Pride Month, is that I've got your back. And it's not only me, but it's millions of other people that have your back. And I know the politics gets loud, and it's messy, and it is heartbreaking. But just remember that the majority of Americans are on your side. And it is okay, every once in a while, to remind yourself that it's okay to be happy. It's okay to be happy. I love being a dad. I love being married. I love my family. I love who I am. I love that I made it out. I made it out of the closet and I am alive, and that's what I celebrate every Pride Month. The fact that I'm still here. You should celebrate that too. And don't let anyone rob you of that joy. And I know that they go on TV and radio and on their podcasts and their emails, and they make it really, really loud, and they're trying to make you believe that the world is against you, and it is not. It's just them. It's a very vocal minority of people who are against you. So this Pride Month, I hope that you give yourself permission to be happy that you are here, happy that you are you. And please, parents, remind your kids that they are loved.
And speaking, I promise this really is my last question here. But speaking of being remiss, I myself am from Indiana.
Hey.
I was raised in Indiana. I went to school in Indiana. Go Hoosiers. Um, I need to establish this on the record once and for all. What is the ranch of choice in the Buttigieg household?
Oh man, sometimes I make my
No
own
pressure.
ranch. We don't have enough time to get into the world of ranch dressing. But is that a thing here in Southern Florida?
I'm making it a thing.
But like, is it like a common side? Because I've been, you know, I travel all around the country.
It is if I'm in the room.
Ranch dressing is, you know, it's got to have the right consistency of tang. You know, to like we don't have enough time, right? The viscosity. But I'm a huge. That makes my Midwestern heart sing. It's like I need a fried cheese and a bucket of ranch dressing.
Amen. No, people really don't understand like how nuanced and complex a debate this is. I mean, when it comes to, you know, the dressing versus the dip, you know.
Oh yeah, Pete got in huge trouble on the internet because there's this Mexican restaurant in South Bend, Indiana that mixes salsa with ranch dressing.
Oh.
And people are like, that is disgusting. It's like, hey, don't knock it till you try it. But welcome to the Midwest, right? We lean into the weirdness.
I'll have to add that one to my list. That is not a combination I could claim at this point,
Yeah.
but I'm very intrigued now. All right. Chasten, thank you so much for your time here today.
Thanks for having me. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, Chasten.